Hello, I'm Sally Weiner Grotta, and this is Judith Magazine's Tell Me More, where I chat with Jewish authors, editors, and other creatives about the stories behind their creations. My guest today is Shlomo Levin and his sidekick Shalzed, the alien. Shlomo says that a long time ago he received rabbinic ordination from the Israeli chief rabbinate and the yeshivat Hamitvar. I mispronounced that, I apologize. And for many years he served as a rabbi in the United States. More recently, he went back to school and he earned an MA in International Law and Human Rights from the United Nations University of Peace, which I didn't even know existed. That sounds wonderful. Shlomo writes the stories of Shalzed. Now, Shalzed is a blue-skinned alien who's using his time stranded on Earth to try to understand why it's so difficult for us Earthlings to guarantee basic human rights to all humans. I get that. I'm having difficulty with that myself. Shlomo is also the author of the Human Right to Gada, which introduces rabbinic and secular texts and questions for those who would like to use the retelling of the Passover Seder story as an opportunity to discuss human rights. Shlomo's essays and columns have appeared in the Jewish News Syndicate, Times of Israel, and Opinio Juris. Welcome, Shlomo. It's good to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And here is Shalzed. Could you please tell us a story about Shalzed?
Okay, so thank you. Thank you again for having me, first of all. Shalzed, and we'll see in just a moment how he got his name, is an alien who has come to Earth, and you'll see in a moment why. But let me just preface by saying the goal here is to use fiction to make human rights more accessible, more immediate, and easier for us to get involved with. And the purpose of his series is to help us inquire, to help us ask questions. And rather than human rights being used as a political tool to condemn people with or to bludgeon people with, this is what I say all the time. I see human rights primarily important as a shared language for dialogue and for understanding, that we can begin to put our disagreements in the context of human rights, and we can say, I agree with this, I believe this, we believe similar things. Maybe we just weigh them differently. Maybe we have slightly different understandings, but to facilitate communication and understanding, that's what this is really for. So I'm going to read to you here an episode of Shalzed, and this is how he first meets Simon, who is his friend that he meets on Earth, who helps him go around and to understand a little bit more what's going on. So I'll read to you for a couple of minutes. It says like this. It all began at the library. Dina Perlstein, whose son Aaron is in my 8th grade Mishnah class, spotted me just as I finished checking out a new Grisham novel on the self-checkout machine. Morris Simon, she said as she hurried over. I have to talk to you about the test that you gave last week. It always embarrassed me to be called Moreh outside of school. Nice to see you, I said, glancing towards the door. Since she was Orthodox, I didn't offer to shake her hand. I just finished grading. Tomorrow, I'll give the test back to the class. Did Aaron do all right? Now, why do parents think I know every kid's grade by heart? I think so, I told her. I don't recall off the top of my head. Remember, he was very busy the night before the test preparing for his bar mitzvah. I'm sure you agree that has to take precedence. Just then, the red flashing light went on at the library exit, and the gate made an alarm sound. We both turned to look. A man with pale blue skin and pointy ears was stuck at the locked turnstile, looking bewildered. Did you forget to check out that book? The librarian called from behind the desk. The man frowned. Check out? He asked. The librarian looked annoyed. That book you're holding, did you check it out? The man scratched his chin. Why did this electronic apparatus suddenly begin emitting photons of approximately a 700 nanometer wavelength and causing atmospheric oscillations of such an unpleasant type? He asked. The librarian stared, but I laughed. I decided to walk over. This man seemed to need a little help. and it was a good excuse to get away from Mrs. Pearlstein. Have you used the library before? I asked him, extending my hand. He shook his head. I noticed that the title of the book he was holding was an illustrated guide to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A woman pushing a stroller came behind us, so I nudged him out of the way, back towards an unoccupied table at the edge of the library. No, he said simply. Do you have a card? I asked. He opened the book and turned to a page which he found quickly from memory. Everyone has the right to receive and impart information and ideas through any media, he quoted. So I must be allowed to take this book. I chuckled. Listen, to borrow a book from the library, you need a card. He narrowed his eyes and looked around the library like he was afraid the walls would start closing in and he had been lured into some sort of a trap. Do you live around here? I asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. Then he told me a story so incredible that at the time I thought he was crazy. But by now, I've personally verified at least most of it, and so I know that it's true. He said that he is from a troubled civilization about 10 light years away. Their species has divided into hundreds of warring tribes. They kill each other, constantly inventing even more powerful weapons, and they have already destroyed countless moons, asteroids, and even planets as there's wars spread throughout their solar system. In each of their tribes, a few rich leaders oppress the poor. The masses live in miserable squalor as the rich keep them divided and weak due to perpetual fear of rebellion. He had been observing Earth closely. He determined that we have intelligent life based on the light and radio signals we're emitting. He also observed that our atmosphere is clean, water is flowing, and life everywhere is abundant. So he came to Earth to find out how we do it. He wanted to know how we built the peaceful, utopian society that he believed we had. When he first arrived, he asked every human he encountered to tell him how our society works. I could only imagine the jokes and chuckles that must have earned him. Then finally, someone sent him to the library, where a librarian gave him the book about human rights he now has in his hands. Earth is far from perfect, I told him. We have wars, injustice, and oppression too. He took a sharp breath and stared down at the floor. But it says here, he began, pointing to the book. That's in theory, I told him. It's different in practice. He raised his head and stared at me. But why? I shrugged. I don't know. It just is. It's hard to make everyone respect other people's rights. The truth is, I had never really given it much thought. I noticed the thick, bluish liquid on his cheek and had the sense he was starting to cry. He told me that he had been planning to return right back to his planet with the book he was holding, but he wouldn't do so if human rights didn't really work. We talked for quite a while. In the end, we agreed that I would help him understand why human rights are so complicated and difficult, so he could decide what report to bring back. I also agreed to let him take the book out on my car. I'm not sure if he realizes he's supposed to return it in 3 weeks, but even if he doesn't, everything I've learned with him so far has made it worthwhile. Before we parted that first time, I asked his name. The first syllable sounded like a W followed by a bleeding goat, and it ended with what seemed to me like a combination of a sneeze and a hiccup. There was no way I would be able to pronounce anything from his native tongue, so I decided to call him Shalzed. I got that by combining the Hebrew words shalom, which means peace, and tzedek, which means justice. That's what he came to Earth searching for, so I figured it's fitting. So that's the introduction of how Shalzed we first met him.
I love it. I love the whole concept, and it's charming. Thank you so much for reading that. Now, Shalzed has some really interesting interactions. And by the way, folks, they are fictional. I described this to somebody, and they wanted to know how you were managing to get to talk to all those people. But various earthlings, like an archbishop, like just so many different kinds of people. I'd like Shalzed, or from Shalzed's point of view, if you could tell us a bit about the conversation he had with Spain's UN ambassador, Hector Gomez.
Yeah. So first of all, Shalzed, when he interacts with notable politicians or activists on Earth. It's always real people in a fictionalized interview. And a main reason why I do that is because I want you to see that what Shalzed is writing is based on sources, based on real sources. And so there'll be links in the article to a statement or a news coverage or something like that, where the person he is speaking with made the statement that he's making, or a paraphrase of the statement that he's making, so that you can see for yourself kind of how it relates. So Hector Gomez was a good example. So Shells had met him outside the United Nations building. And he was leaving the UN, and Shells had said, "Well, what's going on? You're leaving the UN because maybe someone said something you disagree with, you know?" And so Hector Gomez, the ambassador from Spain, says, "What do you mean? People say things I disagree with all the time, you know?" So then Shells says, "Oh, yeah, so why did you walk out then when Bibi Netanyahu was speaking at the UN? If people are always saying things you disagree with, what's going on? Is Bibi somehow special, or somehow what's going on with that?" And then Hector Gomez articulated the position that he wanted to take a stand against what he calls genocide and what he believes are, atrocities Israel's committing and all that kind of stuff. Whereas Shalzad asked him, "Well, isn't the United Nations a place for dialogue? Isn't the purpose of the United Nations for diplomats who disagree with each other to talk to each other and to try to resolve this problem?" He even asked the question as a question. He quotes the ambassador from Canada, who specifically didn't walk out and said, "I didn't walk out because it's my job to listen to people I disagree with and try to understand their positions. That's what the job of diplomacy is." And Shalzad even asks the question, if the diplomats at the United Nations won't speak to each other and walk out on each other and walk out on Bibi, how can we ask grassroots activists to try to talk to each other, to try to have empathy for the other side, and to try to understand each other's positions? But then each issue ends with discussion questions. And one of the questions became, when is or is a walkout an appropriate form of protest? When is it an appropriate form of protest? Is there ever a time where it's right to walk out? Or do ideas we disagree with need to be listened to? Which I think is a very universal question that we can relate to in many contexts.
Yes. It is intriguing how you have taken this fantastical creature of your imagination and using it as a meaningful ethical and philosophical issues and sociopolitical issues, a point of discussion. I love the idea of having an outsider, a being from a planet 10 light years away from Earth. I mean, totally ignorant about who we are. And that being is asking questions about whatever controversy or argument that's being addressed. And he has no vested interest. He doesn't have a side, so that you can actually get into having the episode have both sides of the subject aired. But what I want to know is, you as the writer, how do you manage to balance and portray the positions and attitudes of people with whom you may disagree? Is there what is it in you that can go ahead and try to be even-handed with these kinds of issues that it appears quite clearly you do disagree with some of them, and with a significant number of them? How do you handle that, and what is it?
I want to give you two answers to that. One is, I think that is critical to writing fiction. Is that fiction, as you're a writer yourself, fiction thrives on conflict. Fiction requires conflict. But for the conflict, or for the villain, or let's say, to not be flat, for the villain not to be a cardboard construct of evil, both sides to the conflict have to genuinely perceive themselves as doing what's right and good and necessary from their divergent perspectives. And to write fiction is to develop that skill of empathizing with and trying to understand and empathize with other opposing perspectives, number one. I want to give you another answer, though, specific to this, which is with regards to human rights. So much of what I want to emphasize in this project, and also in my other writing as well, human rights is so often used simply as a weapon. meaning it's used to condemn, it's used to berate, it's used to put myself up and other people down, whatever it is. This is what it's for. You know, it's used for anger, it's used for self-righteousness, and so forth. And what I want to emphasize is that human rights are an impossible thicket of conflicting of conflicts, meaning we all can agree to human rights. We can all agree to basic human rights and still disagree with one another about what's the right thing to do. Human rights conflict all the time. You know, that's the problem, and that's the way I choose to see these things most of the time. Is they're both sides are looking towards upholding human rights, but weigh them differently, or see the facts differently, or see priorities differently. And that's the way to look at it. And I think that that's very helpful for trying to be able to break down barriers and to begin a dialogue.
Does
You
it
know, I mean, Hector Gomez sees himself as doing what's right. He believes he needs to take a stand here. But there's other, you know, what is more important? Sometimes when do you take a stand and when do you have to have dialogue? That's a universal question, you know, so.
in writing in those voices? Does at any time are you beginning to be more empathetic with those characters, with try to soften your opinion of them, or is it affecting you in some way to be writing in their voices, in voices that really believe in their stands?
Um, Look, there are some people, for example, I mean, look, there's out there, we don't want to get overly political. I mean, we live in a world filled with hate, specifically hatred of Israel, you know, and I don't have a soft spot for that. I don't condone that type of hate, you know. And I don't want to include that type of thing in Shalzed's stories, you know. Although we will talk about, of course, issues, you know, related to Israel, and issues which people can disagree about, which there can be two sides to. I think that, yeah, I do have my own feelings and my own opinions, but I want to even try to model that in the Shalzed pieces. Whereas if someone says something which I don't agree with or which I dislike, rather than say, oh, they must be hateful, they must be anti-Semitic, rather to go and attack their motivations or to attack them as a person, say, look, they must weigh things differently than I do, you know, or they must have some different information than I do, or something like that, and to try to look at it from that perspective as much as I can.
That's lovely. I hope others will do the same. Um, how What do you hope to achieve with your Shalzed stories? Do you feel that it can act? Are you hoping to achieve more dialogue? What is it that you want to achieve with them?
I think there's a number of things I really view as important and critical goals of it. I think number one, human rights in many segments of the Jewish community has a really bad name because of its association with hatred of Israel and its constant emphasis of the human rights community of, I mean, to be very blunt, disproportionately focusing and condemning Israel. That's funny. That's something which comes up in the episode I'm writing for this coming week. Is Shalzed and Simon go to look at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and you know, Shalzed is all gung ho about it. This is the greatest thing. We just need this on my planet. And then he finds out, you know, the Human Rights Council has condemned Israel more than every other country in the world combined. You know what's going on here. So, but my number one, what I want to do is in the Jewish community to show us that human rights is more than condemning Israel. Human rights needs to be more broader than that. And we can't throw away human rights because it's essential to our shared goal of tikkun olam and building a better world. But the human rights is many different issues, many different values, many conflicting rights, many difficulties, and many things that we need to delve in for conversation and to try to get past that. That's number one. Then number two, I want to model dialogue. You know, Shalza disagrees, Simon disagrees, but they always do it in a way which is respectful, in a way which is not ad hominem, and to try to bring that spirit of using human rights to show that human rights do not need to be weaponized, but that human rights can be very valuable as helping us understand one another. So I think that's the other thing I want to model with Shalza.
Wonderful. Now, you have human rights is your work. As Shalzed is just part of it. you have another of your exploration of human rights is the Haggadah you wrote. Could you please tell us about how that came about?
I have a copy here, the Human
Yes.
Rights Haggadah. I know it's hard to see in the screen like this. So the Human Rights Haggadah, what I did is I took the Passover story and broke it down thematically into what we would call today human rights questions that come up in the Passover story. And what's wonderful about it is nearly everything that is important to human rights today is there in Passover.
Mm-hmm.
Both oppression, obviously the oppression of the Israelites and of the different types or varieties or methods of oppression. And then number two, the very difficult question of the quest for freedom. And what are the limits or what are the means? How do we go about fighting oppression without becoming oppressors ourselves? How do we go about fighting oppression and start fighting for our own rights without violating the rights of others? What does that mean? You know, as we talk about the plagues, we talk about the splitting of the sea and so forth. So for each section of the Haggadah where it breaks down add the human rights question, then what I do is I add here, as you can see on the screen, I add usually a from the rabbis box, which brings something from the Jewish tradition about that issue or question. Then I have a yellow box, which is from human rights, from more modern legal or human rights texts, where I give something from today about that issue. It could be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or some other treaty or some other source. And then very, very important, a question box, which sort of frames the dialogue. Why would we perceive the Jewish source and the secular source as being in tension, or would we perceive them as being the same? What are the complications that arise when trying to fulfill this right? What are some of the difficulties? And then it usually ends with just a one sentence or so question for people who would like to discuss this further at the Seder.
Interesting. Sounds fascinating. I look forward to reading it. Do you have a quick sample of one topic and how you've approached it with this?
Okay, so here, I just opened up almost at random the Haggadah. So we say here a famous line from the Haggadah. Avadim hayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to the Pharaoh in Egypt, and God took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And if God had not redeemed us and God had not redeemed our ancestors from Egypt, then we, along with our children and all future generations, would still be slaves to the Pharaoh in Egypt. And I remember even reading this as a child, and I wondered, there's no slaves today, right? Slavery has been banned. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights bans slavery. No one can keep slaves. Would we really be slaves today, or would we already be set free? But I have here a quote from the International Labor Organization. Forced labor, about what does it mean when there's forced labor? What does forced labor mean? Forced labor is when persons are coerced to work through the use of violence or intimidation or debt or retention of identity papers and so forth. A source from Maimonides, which says that a person has the right, says if a worker already began to quit to work, but changes his mind, even in the middle of the day, he can quit because the children of Israel are slaves unto me. They're slaves to God and not slaves to other humans. I mean, Maimonides is saying that the right to quit is what makes you can't quit on God, but you can quit on your human boss. That's the difference. And then there's a little bit more here, but then I ended up with the question of what does it mean that there's something called modern slavery. The International Labor Organization says that 27 million people are still slaves today in the world. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a slave today? The question is, when do coercion, threats, low or no wages, and bad working conditions combine to create conditions that should be considered modern slavery today? What is slavery in the world today? So that's something to think about. You know, where does maybe difficult economic circumstances end and slavery begins?
Yes. Yeah.
I think there's about 17 topics in the Haggadah. There's a lot of them. It's much too much for any one Seder.
Well, you can return to it every year to ask another question.
Right,
you are very involved in a lot of ethical questions, philosophical, ethical, faith-based questions in many cases. And you've just told me that you've actually just finished or about to finish a novel. Is that correct?
I did. Finished. It's ready for an agent. It's ready for that whole process. Yes, finished.
Fabulous. Congratulations, first of all.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about it? I don't want you giving away too much, but tell us a little bit about it.
I'll tell you how the story starts because it also relates to Passover and it's a fun start. You have a rabbi, a modern Orthodox rabbi in a small town, and he gets together with all his colleagues to sell chametz, the food you can't own, not only the leavened food, and not only can't you eat it, but you're not allowed to own it on Passover either. So the tradition is for thousands of years already, we sell it to a non-Jew over the holiday. And then when the holiday concludes, the non-Jew sells it back, which has been done for thousands of
So
years.
these are things we would normally have in our pantry, but we can't clean up the house completely, so we get rid of it by not owning it on paper. Correct?
Yeah, the rabbis even say now it's also an ethical issue. In olden times they didn't have preservatives, so saving food from before the holiday till a week after was not an option. Today, to start throwing away vast amounts of food that's in boxes and cans, that would be considered wasteful and not even ethical to do so. So anyway, that comes up also in the book. I'll mention it in a moment. So what happens is the rabbis gather together to do the sale of chametz, and they sell it to an elderly Muslim man who is the head of the interfaith council in their city, who has been doing this ritual for many, many years, for decades. And it really is a symbol of coexistence that a non-Jew agrees to do this ritual for Jewish people and so forth. So all is well. And this year he's accompanied by his son, Yusuf, because he's become more unable to drive due to medications and so forth. Anyway, he doesn't return after the holiday to sell back the chametz. And the rabbis look after him to see what happened. It turns out he's been hospitalized. And before the rabbi arrives to visit him in the hospital, he passes away. So what do the rabbis do? They say, we need to do this ritual of buying the chametz back from Yusuf, his son. The thing is, Yusuf, and interestingly, he had already said he is a Palestinian activist. He had already said at the moment when they were selling the chametz, when the rabbis say as part of the ritual, say, we are presented with a moral problem to throw away all this food, and so therefore we've decided to do this sale. He said, and rabbis, isn't the occupation of Palestine a moral problem too? What are you doing about that? He says, the rabbis don't want to hear that at the sale of chametz. And their father tells them, this isn't the time to talk about Palestine now. It's almost a holiday. Be quiet. But Yusuf is very upset. And also his brother, it turns out, was visiting family in the West Bank and is unable to return for their father's funeral because of a closure imposed by the Israeli armed forces. And he's active in the BDS movement. And he announces he will not complete the ritual to sell the chametz back to the rabbis until the rabbinical council condemns Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. And thus begins a very difficult dilemma for the rabbi, because you can imagine the rabbi himself is a bit of a left-wing bent, and there are many congregants who say, Rabbi, what's so difficult about it? Just say it's completely uncalled for that Israel didn't let this man come and return for his father's funeral. Just say that you condemn Israel's heartless treatment of this person. What's the difficulty? Then again, the president of the congregation is adamant that the Jewish community must never criticize Israel. We have all critics all around the world, and that the Jewish community must stand behind Israel. And it becomes a very strong rift within the congregation. And then the story continues from there.
Marvelous. Marvelous setup.
But it affects his wife, it affects his family, it affects his job, and ultimately, most importantly, it affects his own beliefs of what does it mean to be a rabbi and what does he want to do,
Very good. Just a point of clarification. The man that buys the hummus isn't actually physically taking it. It's that he owns it, so therefore it's not.
Right. It's just a ritual. He just has to come do some rituals to show that he bought it. He tugs a handkerchief, he signs a piece of paper, and then he goes home. That's all he has to do.
Yeah. So, but they can't touch it because it's his property now, even if it is in their home. And it's a fascinating ethical dilemma and socio-political dilemma. I look forward to reading it. I hope we get an agent soon and that it sells very quickly.
Thank you.
Shlomo, this has been a delight. Very meaningful and charming and fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of Shalzed and hopefully reading your new novel and reading your Haggadah.
And good luck to you with the books you're publishing too.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My guest today was Shlomo Levin.
Should I just mention the website?
Oh, well, I will be.
Oh, good. Okay.
My guest today was Shlomo Levin, a human rights advocate and the creator of Shalzed, an alien who is trying to understand Earthlings who have inscribed great treatises on human rights and yet don't abide by them. He is also the author of the Human Rights Haggadah and of a forthcoming novel sometime soon. You can connect with Shalzed and Shlomo on Shalzed's Substack, which is called Stories of Shalzed, on Shalzed's Facebook page, and on Shalzed's website. Shlomo also has a website for the Human Rights Haggadah. As for me, my latest book is Daughters of Eve, an essay-based discussion workbook and journaling guide that uses the stories of biblical women as a filter to explore our modern concerns, crises, and hopes for the future. You can connect with me on my website, sallywienergrotta.com, as well as on Facebook, sometimes on Blue Sky, not too often, and on Substack, actually 2 Substacks. My own What If, Why Not, How, as well as here on Tell Me More, a podcast of Judith Magazine, a journal of Jewish arts, letters, and empowerment. Thank you, and thank you, Shlomo and Shalzed.